What's a health myth that drives you crazy because you know it's false? Story 1. Oh man, the whole idea that you can alkalinize your blood by eating certain foods or drinking special water drives me absolutely insane, because that's just not how the human body works at all. Your body is running one of the most tightly controlled systems imaginable when it comes to blood pH, and it keeps it locked in a super narrow range around 7.35, 7.45. And if it drifts even a little outside that, you're not healthier, you're in serious medical trouble. Like, we're talking hospital level problems, not I should drink more lemon water territory. People love to say things like, this food is alkaline so it balances your blood. But your stomach is literally full of acid and your digestive system breaks everything down, and then your kidneys and lungs handle the actual regulation of your blood pH, not your smoothie. You cannot override that system with kale or baking soda or whatever TikTok trend is going around this week. If food could meaningfully change your blood pH, we'd all be dropping dead after a cheeseburger. What has changed is your urine pH, which people then misunderstand and think it reflects their blood, but it doesn't. It just shows your body doing its job and getting rid of excess stuff. It's just wild how this myth refuses to die, because it sounds scientific enough to be believable, but in reality, it completely ignores basic human physiology. Story 2. My mom complaining that the doctor refuses to give her antibiotics for a common cold drives me up the wall every single time, because it's like we've had the same conversation 100 times and it just never sticks. Antibiotics are for bacteria, not viruses. And the common cold is caused by viruses. So taking antibiotics for it is basically useless. Like, it's not the doctor being difficult or stingy or whatever. It's literally them doing their job correctly and not handing out medication that won't help in the first place. And the part that really gets me is when people say, but last time I took antibiotics, I got better. Yeah, because colds go away on their own after a few days anyway. Not because the antibiotics did anything magical. It's just coincidence, but somehow that turns into proof that they work. Meanwhile, overusing antibiotics is a real problem because it helps create antibiotic resistance, which is actually scary because then when you do have a bacterial infection, the meds might not work anymore. Plus, antibiotics can mess with your gut, give you side effects, and generally do more harm than good if you're taking them for no reason. Doctors aren't withholding them to be annoying. They're trying to avoid exactly that. It just blows my mind how this myth is still so common, because the science here isn't even complicated. It's just that people really want a quick fix, even when the fix doesn't actually exist. Story 3. This one drives me crazy. The idea that Pam cooking spray somehow has 0 calories and is automatically healthier than regular cooking oil, because that's not really how it works. The whole 0 calories thing comes from a labeling loophole where if a serving is tiny enough, like a fraction of a second spray, they can round it down to 0. But in reality, it's still oil, and oil has calories, period. If you actually use it like a normal human being and spray for a few seconds, you're absolutely adding calories, you're just not counting them. And don't get me wrong, it can be useful. Like, if you're trying to use less oil overall, sure, a light spray can help with that, but pretending it's some magical calorie-free substance is just misleading. It's basically just a more controlled way to apply oil, not a completely different thing. What really gets me is when people act like it's automatically healthier than something like olive oil, when olive oil actually has nutritional benefits and has been studied a ton, while cooking sprays are just convenience products. Health isn't just about lowering calories at all costs, it's also about what you're actually consuming. It's just one of those marketing-driven myths that sounds great on paper, but falls apart the second you look at it realistically, because at the end of the day, oil is still oil, whether it comes out of a bottle or a spray can. Story 4. People throw around natural like it automatically means safe and processed, like it automatically means unhealthy, when in reality those words barely mean anything on their own. Like, arsenic is natural, cyanide is natural, Poisonous mushrooms are natural. You still don't want any of those anywhere near you. Natural just means it exists in nature, not that it's good for your body. On the flip side, processed just means a food has been changed from its original form in some way, and that can be as simple as washing, cutting, freezing, or cooking. Bread is processed, yogurt is processed, even something like pasteurized milk is processed, and that process literally makes it safer to drink. But people hear processed and immediately think it's toxic junk, which is just not true. What actually matters is how something is processed and what's been added to it. Yeah, ultra-processed foods loaded with sugar, salt, and additives probably aren't great if you're eating them all the time, but lumping those in with every processed food is just lazy thinking. It's just such an oversimplified way to look at nutrition, and it ends up confusing people more than helping them, because instead of understanding what they're eating, they're just reacting to buzzwords that sound healthy or unhealthy without any real context. Story 5. Cold drinks will make your food congeal inside you. Thing sounds convincing for about 5 seconds until you actually think about how the body works. I've even heard people take it further and claim it can lead to heart attacks. And the reasoning is always that same kitchen sink analogy. What happens when you pour grease down the drain and then add cold water? Like your body is just a set of pipes. Except it's not. Your body isn't sitting at room temperature like your plumbing. It's constantly regulated at around 37 degrees Celsius, and it works really hard to keep it that way. Anything cold you drink gets warmed up almost immediately once it hits your stomach. So it's not just hanging out there chilling your food into some kind of solid mass. There's no scenario where your lunch turns into a grease clog inside your intestines. Digestion itself is also way more complex than food goes in, hardens, gets stuck. Your body uses enzymes, bile, and constant muscular movement to break everything down and move it along smoothly. Fats don't just sit there waiting to solidify like bacon grease in a pipe. They're emulsified and processed step by step. The whole plumbing comparison just falls apart when you realize your body is an active, temperature-controlled, chemical processing system, not a passive tube. It's one of those myths that sounds logical on the surface, but completely ignores basic biology. Story 6. This one is way too oversimplified, and it bugs me every time I hear someone say, salt is bad for you, like it's some kind of poison you should avoid completely, when in reality salt is literally essential for your body to function. Like, you actually need sodium to survive. It helps regulate fluid balance, supports nerve function, and keeps your muscles working properly, including your heart. Without enough of it, things can go sideways pretty fast. The real issue is too much salt, not salt itself. Yeah, if you're constantly eating super salty processed foods, that can contribute to high blood pressure and other problems over time. But that doesn't mean the solution is to cut it out entirely. Your body needs a baseline level, and if you drop below that, you can start feeling it. People don't realize that low sodium can cause symptoms too, like dizziness, fatigue, headaches, even confusion in more serious cases, especially if you're sweating a lot, drinking tons of water, or not eating much. Your sodium levels can dip, and you'll feel awful without really knowing why. It's just another case of people taking a real health concern and turning it into an extreme rule, when the truth is way more balanced. Salt isn't the enemy, it's just something you need to keep in the right range, like a lot of things in nutrition. Story 7. Humanity survived just fine before vaccinations. Yeah, humanity didn't go extinct before vaccines. But that doesn't mean people were thriving. Child mortality was insanely high. Families would lose multiple kids to diseases that are now preventable. And outbreaks of things like measles, polio, and smallpox would just rip through communities on a regular basis. People weren't just getting a little sick and bouncing back either. A lot of these diseases caused lifelong complications, disability, or death. And it was just normal. That was the baseline people accepted because they didn't have a better option. Saying we survived is kind of like saying people survived before seatbelt. Yeah, but a lot more people died in the process. Vaccines didn't show up to fix a minor inconvenience, they dramatically reduced suffering and death on a massive scale. Diseases that used to be a constant threat are now rare or even eradicated in some cases. And that's not an accident. It just feels like people are looking at the past through a very filtered lens, ignoring how harsh it actually was. Because if you really look at the numbers and the reality of it, just fine is not the phrase you'd use at all. Story 8. This one is super common, and it always surprises people when you explain it, because everyone assumes a stuffy nose just means it's packed full of mucus blocking everything up. Like, yeah, there is mucus involved sometimes, but that's not actually the main reason you feel congested. What's really going on is that the structures inside your nose, called turbinates, swell up. These are normal parts of your nasal cavity that help filter and humidify the air you breathe. But when you're sick, dealing with allergies, or irritated by something, they get inflamed and expand. That swelling narrows the airway, so even if there isn't a ton of mucus, it suddenly feels like you can't breathe properly through your nose. That's also why sometimes you blow your nose over and over and nothing really changes, because you're not clearing the actual problem. The blockage isn't just stuff sitting there, it's the tissue itself taking up more space. It also explains why things like decongestants or even a hot shower can help, because they reduce that swelling rather than just trying to remove mucus. It's just one of those things that feels obvious until you think about it a bit deeper, because the sensation tricks you into believing your nose is clogged with something solid, when really it's more about inflammation and swelling messing with your airflow. Story 9. The idea that you can target fat loss in a specific area just by training that area is one of those things that refuses to die, even though it's been debunked forever. Like, doing 1,000 crunches isn't going to magically burn belly fat, and endless tricep exercises won't specifically get rid of arm fat, even though that's exactly how it's marketed most of the time. When your body burns fat, it pulls from overall energy stores, not from the exact muscle you're using at that moment. So you can absolutely strengthen and build muscle in a specific area, but the fat on top of it comes off based on your genetics, hormones, and overall calorie balance, not because you targeted that spot. That's why someone can have strong abs underneath and still not have a visible six-pack until their overall body fat drops. What makes this myth stick is that people feel the burn in a specific area and assume that means fat is being burned there. But that sensation is just muscle fatigue, not localized fat loss. It also doesn't help that fitness marketing leans hard into it, because lose belly fat fast sells way better than gradually lose fat everywhere based on biology you don't fully control. It's frustrating because people end up putting in a ton of effort expecting a very specific result, when in reality the process just doesn't work that way at all. Story 10. This one is so deeply ingrained it's almost impossible to argue against, especially with parents, because they are 100% convinced that stepping outside with wet hair is basically a guaranteed way to get sick. But getting sick doesn't come from being cold or having damp hair, it comes from viruses and bacteria. If you didn't get exposed to something, you're not just going to magically develop a cold because you walked outside after a shower. I think the confusion comes from the fact that colds tend to happen more in colder weather, so people connect the dots and assume the temperature itself is the cause. But what's actually happening is that people spend more time indoors, closer together, which makes it easier for viruses to spread. Plus, cold air can dry out your nasal passages a bit, which might make it slightly easier for viruses to take hold. But that's very different from cold air makes you sick. Walking outside with wet hair might make you feel uncomfortable or chilly, sure, but it's not injecting a virus into your system. If that were true, every swimmer would be constantly sick. It's just one of those old school beliefs that feels logical on the surface, but falls apart when you look at what actually causes illness. Because the real trigger is exposure to germs, not the temperature or whether your hair is dry. Story 11. The whole gluten is poison thing gets blown way out of proportion, and it's frustrating when people treat it like a universal truth instead of something that only actually applies to specific medical conditions. Gluten isn't inherently bad. It's just a protein found in things like wheat, barley, and rye. And for the vast majority of people, it's completely fine to eat. The only time gluten is genuinely a problem is if someone has celiac disease or a diagnosed sensitivity, where the body reacts negatively to it. In those cases, yeah, avoiding gluten is necessary. But for people without that, cutting it out doesn't magically make their diet healthier. It just removes a whole category of foods for no real reason. What's weird is that a lot of gluten-free products are actually more processed and sometimes higher in sugar or fats to make up for texture and taste. So it's not automatically a healthier swap. Bread isn't evil just because it contains gluten. And kids especially don't benefit from unnecessary restrictions like that unless there's a real medical reason, because you're limiting their diet without any actual upside. It's one of those trends that started from a real condition but got turned into a blanket fear. And now people are treating a normal part of many diets like it's toxic, when for most people, it's just food. Story 12. That one is straight up marketing fantasy dressed up as science, and it works because it uses just enough real terminology to sound legit. Tooth enamel does not regrow. Once it's gone, it's gone. It doesn't have living cells, so it can't regenerate like skin or bone. What can happen is something called remineralization, where weakened enamel gets strengthened a bit by minerals like calcium and phosphate. But that's not the same as rebuilding lost enamel or growing it back. It's more like reinforcing what's still there. And yeah, chewing gum can help a little with that process, but not because it has some magical repair ingredient. It's mostly because chewing stimulates saliva, which helps neutralize acids and brings minerals into your mouth. So when these natural gums claim they can repair and regrow enamel, they're basically taking a tiny real effect, saliva helping protect teeth, and exaggerating it into something that sounds like sci-fi dentistry. If gum could actually regrow enamel, dentists wouldn't be drilling cavities or using fillings anymore. They just hand you a pack of gum and call it a day. It's just another case of natural plus buzzwords plus TikTok marketing means people thinking a snack can do what modern dental science still can't fully achieve yet. Story 13. That whole non-fat means healthier mindset is such a leftover from old diet culture, and it's honestly pretty misleading. People see fat-free on a label and automatically assume it's the better choice, so when in reality it often just means something was removed and replaced with something else. When fat gets taken out of food, especially things like yogurt, dressings, or snacks, the taste usually goes with it. So companies add sugar, artificial flavors, or other additives to make it palatable again. So you end up with something that's lower in fat but higher in sugar, or more processed overall, which isn't exactly a win. And fat itself isn't the enemy anyway. Your body actually needs it for things like hormone production, absorbing vitamins like A, D, E, and K, and just keeping you full and satisfied after eating. Cutting it out completely can backfire because you're hungrier sooner and are more likely to snack or overeat later. It's also funny how something like full-fat yogurt can keep you satisfied for hours, while the non-fat version might leave you wanting more pretty quickly. But people still assume the non-fat one is better just because of that label. It's just another example of how a single word on packaging can shape people's thinking, even when the reality is way more nuanced than less fat means more health. Story 14. That's just how the system works. But the idea that having a corporate middleman between you and your doctor somehow makes everything better for patients is questionable at best. You've got this extra layer that's taking a cut, setting rules, deciding what gets covered and what doesn't, and somehow that's supposed to improve care. Instead, it often turns into a maze of approvals, denials, and weird incentives where doctors have to spend time justifying treatments instead of just treating people. Patients end up dealing with surprise costs, limited options, and delays. While a chunk of what they're paying doesn't even go toward actual care, it goes toward administrative overhead and, profits. And the frustrating part is how normalized it is. People will defend it like it's the only possible way things could function, even though other systems exist that don't rely as heavily on that kind of setup. It's not that every part of it is useless, but acting like it's universally good for everyone ignores a lot of very real downsides. It's one of those situations where the people actually using the system feel the friction constantly, while the benefits tend to be a lot less obvious on the ground. Story 15. The idea that all chiropractic practices are fully legit across the board is not really accurate. There's a spectrum. Some chiropractors stick to basic musculoskeletal stuff like back pain, posture, and mobility, and in those cases, what they're doing can overlap a lot with physical therapy and can actually help people feel better. But then there's the other side where it drifts into claiming it can fix things like immune issues, digestion, or basically your entire health through spinal adjustment. And that's where it stops being grounded in solid evidence. The whole idea that your spine being slightly misaligned is the root cause of a huge range of diseases just isn't supported the way it's often presented. The thing that makes it tricky is that people do feel relief after adjustment, which reinforces the belief that it's treating more than it actually is. But feeling better in the short term, especially with back or neck tension, doesn't mean it's addressing deeper or unrelated health problems. It's not black and white, but it's also not the miracle solution some people make it out to be. Like a lot of things, it can have a place in a narrow context, but once it starts making big, sweeping health claims, that's where skepticism is more than justified. Story 16. This one is so wildly misunderstood because of TV that people genuinely think a defibrillator is like a restart button for the heart, when it's actually almost the opposite. When you see someone flatline on a show and they yell, "clear," and shock them back to life, that's basically pure fiction. Defibrillators don't restart a stopped heart. If your heart is in a flat line, asystole, shocking it does nothing. What they're actually used for is correcting chaotic heart rhythms, like ventricular fibrillation, where the heart is quivering uselessly instead of pumping blood properly. The shock basically resets the electrical activity, giving the heart a chance to return to a normal rhythm. So it's not start the heart, it's more like interrupt the chaos and hope the normal system kicks back in. If there's no electrical activity at all, there's nothing to reset. That's when CPR and medications come into play. Not shocking. TV has completely flipped this around because it's more dramatic to show someone being brought back with a jolt, but in reality, a flat line plus a shock is a bad sign, not a miracle moment. It's one of those things where the real science is actually more interesting, but way less cinematic, so people end up with a totally wrong mental model of what's actually happening. Story 17. Carbs are bad is one of those blanket statements that sounds simple but completely falls apart the second you look at what carbs actually are. Like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, those are all carbs. You're really gonna tell me apples and oats are somehow the problem? Carbohydrates are your body's main and most efficient source of energy, especially for your brain. Cutting them out entirely isn't some hack, it just forces your body to work around it in a less efficient way. That's why people who go super low carb often feel sluggish at first, because their body is literally adjusting to not having its preferred fuel source. What people are usually reacting to is highly refined carbs, stuff like sugary snacks, white bread, ultra-processed foods that spike your blood sugar and don't keep you full. But instead of making that distinction, it gets dumbed down into all carbs are bad, which just isn't true. It's the same pattern as a lot of nutrition myths. Take a real issue, oversimplify it, and suddenly an entire category of food becomes the enemy. Meanwhile, balanced diets that include carbs have been the norm for basically every healthy population. It's not carbs that are the problem, it's the context, the type, and the overall diet. But that's way less catchy than just blaming carbs for everything. Story 18. The whole juicing is healthier thing sounds great, until you realize you're basically stripping out one of the best parts of fruit and calling it an upgrade. When you juice fruit, you're removing most of the fiber, which is exactly what helps slow down how quickly your body absorbs the sugar. So instead of a steady release of energy, you're getting a much faster spike in blood sugar, which isn't exactly ideal. Like, yeah, it feels healthy because it's fruit and it's liquid and it looks clean and aesthetic. But nutritionally, you've turned it into something closer to a sugary drink than the whole food it started as. If you just ate the orange instead of drinking orange juice, you'd get the fiber, feel fuller, and probably consume less sugar overall. But juice? You can drink like 3 or 4 oranges worth in a minute without even noticing. It's not that juice is poison or anything, it's just not some superior version of fruit like people think. If anything, it's a more concentrated, less balanced version. It's another case where processing something and removing a key component gets marketed as an improvement, when really the original version, just eating the fruit, was already doing the job better. Story 19. That idea that if you can't pronounce it, it must be bad for you is such a weird shortcut people use because it has nothing to do with whether something is actually harmful. It's basically judging food safety based on your reading skills instead of chemistry. A ton of completely normal, safe ingredients sound complicated just because they use scientific names. Like, ascorbic acid is just vitamin C, and dihydrogen monoxide is literally water if you want to be dramatic about it. Meanwhile, there are plenty of perfectly pronounceable things that are actually harmful in the wrong context. The name tells you nothing on its own. It also ignores the fact that food labels are required to use standardized names, which are often more technical than what people use in everyday conversation. That doesn't make them suspicious, it just makes them accurate. And yeah, that sounds like a skill issue response is kinda perfect, because it really is just unfamiliarity being mistaken for danger. Something sounding chemical doesn't make it bad, everything is made of chemicals. It's just another example of people relying on vibes instead of understanding what they're actually looking at, because scary sounding words are a lot easier to react to than learning what those ingredients actually do. Story 20. The whole drink 8 glasses of water a day thing gets treated like some universal rule, but it's basically just a rough guideline that somehow turned into law in people's minds. There isn't anything magical about 8 glasses, and your body definitely isn't sitting there counting cups waiting for you to hit a quota. Hydration needs vary a ton depending on your size, activity level, climate, diet, and even things like how much you sweat. Someone working out in the heat is going to need way more than someone sitting indoors all day. And someone eating a lot of fruits and vegetables is already getting a decent amount of water from food. Your body actually has a pretty solid built-in system for this. Thirst. If you're thirsty, drink. If you're not, you probably don't need to force it. Urine color is also a decent quick check. Pale yellow usually means you're doing fine. What's funny is people will be chugging water trying to hit some arbitrary number while ignoring what their body is telling them. Like, it's a checklist instead of a basic biological function. And yeah, overdoing it can even be a problem in extreme cases, so more isn't always better. It's just one of those health rules that stuck around because it's simple and easy to remember, not because it's actually precise or universally correct. Story 21. The whole suck the venom out thing is one of those survival myths that sounds heroic but is actually a terrible idea in real life. It's been in movies forever, so people think it's legit, but it doesn't work the way people imagine at all. Once venom is injected, it spreads through the tissue and bloodstream pretty quickly. It's not just sitting there in a little pocket waiting to be vacuumed out. By the time you'd even try, it's already moving through the body, so you're not meaningfully removing anything. On top of that, you can actually make things worse. Cutting the wound, which is often paired with this myth, increases the risk of infection and tissue damage, and putting your mouth on it can introduce bacteria. And if the person has any small cuts in their mouth, now you've potentially exposed them to venom too, which is just doubling the problem. The real first aid is way less dramatic. Keep the person calm, immobilize the affected limb, and get medical help as fast as possible. That's it. No cowboy movie tricks required. It's one of those myths that sticks around because it feels like you're doing something, but in reality it's ineffective at best and harmful at worst. Story 22. The whole breakfast is the most important meal of the day thing gets repeated like it's some kind of universal biological rule. But it's really not that clear cut, and a lot of it actually comes from old marketing, especially from companies like Kellogg's, who had a pretty obvious incentive to convince people they needed to start every morning with cereal. It's one of those ideas that just stuck around so long that people stopped questioning it. The reality is way more individual than that. Some people wake up hungry and feel better eating early. It helps their energy, focus, and stops them from overeating later in the day. But other people genuinely aren't hungry in the morning and feel totally fine skipping breakfast or eating later. And there's nothing inherently unhealthy about that. Your body doesn't have some built-in alarm that says, you didn't eat at 8 a.m., now everything is ruined. What actually matters is your overall diet and habits across the whole day. Not whether you ate at a specific time because you were told it was the most important. Forcing yourself to eat when you're not hungry doesn't magically make you healthier. It just adds extra calories you might not even need. It's just another example of a simple, catchy idea being pushed so hard that it turns into truth, even though real nutrition is way more flexible than that. Story 23. Seed oils are toxic and inflammatory. You should only cook with butter or tallow. Thing has gotten way bigger online than the actual evidence supports. And it's one of those ideas that sounds scientific but gets simplified way too hard. Seed oils, like sunflower, canola, soybean, etc., get blamed because they contain omega-6 fatty acids. And people run with the idea that omega-6 equals inflammation. But your body actually needs omega-6 fats. And inflammation isn't just caused by one nutrient in isolation, it's about overall diet patterns. In normal amounts, these oils are not doing the damage people claim they are. What's really going on is that a lot of ultra-processed foods contain seed oils. So people associate the two and assume the oil itself is the problem, when it's more about the overall food quality, excess calories, and lifestyle. Meanwhile, butter and tallow get marketed as clean or ancestral, but they're high in saturated fats, which we know can raise LDL cholesterol when consumed in excess. That doesn't make them evil either, but it definitely doesn't automatically make them the healthier option across the board. It's another case of nutrition getting turned into a good versus bad battle, when in reality it's about balance. Seed oils aren't some inflammatory poison, and butter isn't a miracle food. They're just different types of fats that can all fit into a normal diet depending on how you use them. Story 24. The way people talk about seed oils lately is honestly wild. Like canola oil personally wronged them or something. It's gone from a normal cooking ingredient to being blamed for basically every modern health issue. And the intensity of it doesn't really match the evidence. A lot of the panic comes from the idea that seed oils are inflammatory because of omega-6 fats, but that gets taken way out of context. Your body actually needs those fats, and in normal amounts they're not just randomly causing disease. The bigger issue is that these oils show up in a ton of ultra-processed foods, so people connect the dots and assume the oil itself is the villain, instead of looking at the overall diet and lifestyle. Meanwhile, alternatives like butter or tallow get put on a pedestal like they're some kind of ancestral superfood, when they come with their own trade-offs too. It's not like switching oils suddenly fixes everything else going on in someone's diet. What's funny is how it's turned into almost a personality trait for some people. Like, avoiding seed oils is the one thing standing between them and perfect health, when in reality it's just one small piece of a much bigger picture. It's one of those trends where a tiny bit of real science gets blown up into this huge all-encompassing theory, and suddenly a basic kitchen ingredient is being treated like it's responsible for the downfall of humanity. Story 25. Raw milk is a miracle cure thing. Gets pushed way harder than the actual reality supports. And it's one of those cases where natural gets mistaken for better without much scrutiny. People will claim it boosts immunity, fixes gut health, or has all these unique nutrients that pasteurized milk supposedly destroys. But the evidence for those claims just isn't there. What is there is the risk. Raw milk can carry harmful bacteria like E. coli, salmonella, and listeria because it hasn't gone through pasteurization, which is specifically designed to kill those pathogens. That process doesn't magically strip milk of its nutrition. It just makes it safer to drink. You're still getting the same core nutrients like protein, calcium, and vitamins. The benefits people talk about tend to be exaggerated or anecdotal, while the risks are very real and well documented. And it's not just a minor inconvenience either. Infections from contaminated milk can be serious, especially for kids, older adults, or anyone with a weaker immune system. It's another example of something being marketed as traditional or pure, and therefore superior, when in reality modern processing exists for a reason. Raw milk isn't some hidden health hack. It's just milk with an added layer of risk and no meaningful upside over the safer option. Story 26. The idea that the doctor only spent 15 minutes with me, so they must be a fraud, sounds reasonable at first, but it ignores how much medicine happens outside of that face-to-face time. By the time a doctor walks into the room, they've often already reviewed your chart, medical history, lab results, medications, and notes from previous visits, which can easily take 20 plus minutes before you even say a word. Then you add in experience. Someone who has spent 10 plus years studying and practicing isn't approaching your symptoms the same way a beginner would. They're not starting from scratch. They're recognizing patterns they've seen hundreds or thousands of times before. What looks like a quick conclusion is usually the result of years of training compressed into a short interaction. It's like expecting an expert to take as long as a novice just to prove they're being thorough. You wouldn't expect someone with a decade of experience to need hours to solve a problem that a beginner struggles with. And medicine works the same way. Speed doesn't automatically mean they're rushing or careless. It often means they're efficient because they know what to look for. Of course, that doesn't mean every fast diagnosis is perfect. Mistakes can happen. But judging competence purely on how long the appointment felt misses the bigger picture. A short visit doesn't mean you weren't evaluated properly. It often just means you were seen by someone who's done this enough times to get to the point quickly. Story 27. Getting a tan is healthy is one of those things that sounds good because it's tied to being outdoors. But the tan itself is literally your skin responding to damage. It's not a sign of health, it's your body trying to protect itself after UV exposure. There's no bonus health effect you unlock by getting darker. It's just accumulated damage over time. People usually bring up vitamin D as the justification, but you don't need to lie on a beach for hours to get that. A relatively short amount of sun exposure on your face and hands is enough for most people, and beyond that you're not getting extra benefits, you're just increasing your risk. After a certain point, more sun doesn't equal more health, it just equals more UV damage. And the risks aren't theoretical either. Excessive sun exposure is directly linked to skin aging and higher chances of skin cancer. And tanning beds are even worse because they deliver concentrated UV radiation in a controlled blast. The idea that those are somehow a safe tan is just straight up wrong. It's one of those things where people confuse being outside is good with getting a tan is good, when those are not the same at all. You can enjoy sunlight and still protect your skin. You don't need to cook yourself to get the benefits. Story 28. That belief that people with bad mental health conditions are automatically evil or dangerous is such a damaging oversimplification. And it mostly comes from how those conditions get portrayed in the media rather than how they actually show up in real life. Diagnoses like schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder, or narcissistic personality disorder describe patterns of thoughts and behaviors, not someone's morality or worth as a person. The reality is that most people with those conditions are far more likely to be misunderstood, stigmatized, or even harmed than they are to harm others. It's just easier for people to latch onto extreme cases or fictional portrayals and assume that represents everyone, when it really doesn't. A diagnosis doesn't erase someone's ability to make choices, grow, seek treatment, or live a normal life. And it definitely doesn't turn them into some kind of villain by default. There's a huge range of how these conditions present, and reducing people to the worst stereotypes just shuts down any real understanding. It's one of those myths that sticks because it plays into fear, but all it really does is make it harder for people to get help and be seen as human. Story 29. Detox drinks are one of those things that sound like a shortcut to health, but they're basically solving a problem your body already handles perfectly well on its own. You don't need a special tea, juice, or powder to flush toxins, because you already have built-in systems doing that 24/7, mainly your liver and kidneys, and they're way more effective than anything in a bottle. The idea that you're full of vague toxins that need to be cleared out with a drink is just super vague marketing language. If your body actually wasn't able to detox properly, you wouldn't fix it with a smoothie. You'd need medical treatment. These products take normal bodily processes like urination or sweating and rebrand them as something special that only happens if you buy their product. Most of the time, what people feel during a detox is just the effect of eating less, drinking more water, or cutting out junk food for a few days, not because anything is being magically cleansed. It's kind of funny when you think about it, because people are paying for something their body already does for free and does better. The real detox is just staying hydrated, eating reasonably well, and letting your organs do their job like they always have. Story 30. The whole coffee dehydrates you thing gets repeated like it's a hard rule, but it doesn't really hold up the way people think it does. Yeah, caffeine has a mild diuretic effect, but in the amounts most people drink, it's not strong enough to cancel out the water you're actually consuming with the coffee. At the end of the day, coffee is still mostly water, so while you might pee a bit more, you're still taking in fluid overall, not losing more than you gain. Your body adjusts pretty quickly too, especially if you drink coffee regularly, so that diuretic effect becomes even less noticeable over time. People tend to treat it like coffee is somehow pulling water out of you, but it's not working against your hydration like that. If it were, regular coffee drinkers would constantly be dehydrated, which obviously isn't the case. It's just one of those myths that probably started from a small truth. Caffeine can make you pee more, and then got exaggerated into something way bigger. In reality, coffee absolutely still counts toward your daily fluid intake. It's not secretly drying you out just because it has caffeine in it. Story 31. Your brain isn't fully developed until you're X years old. Line gets thrown around like it's some hard cutoff where you suddenly become a complete, finished human. And it's just not how the brain works at all. It makes it sound like before that age your brain is basically incomplete, and after that it's locked in, when in reality neither of those things are true. Yeah, certain parts of the brain, especially things like impulse control and long-term decision making, tend to keep developing into your mid-20s, but that doesn't mean everything before that is unreliable or everything after that is fixed and final. The brain isn't something that just finishes and then stays the same forever. It's constantly changing, adapting, and rewiring based on experience, learning, and environment. If your brain actually stopped developing at a certain age, you wouldn't be able to learn new skills, form new memories, or change habits later in life, which obviously isn't the case. People pick up new careers, languages, and behaviors well into their 30s, 40s, and beyond. That's literally your brain continuing to adapt. The statement ends up being kind of misleading because it turns a gradual, ongoing process into a fixed milestone. and people use it to oversimplify behavior or shut down discussion. The reality is way more nuanced. Your brain is always a work in progress, not something that suddenly becomes done at a specific age. Story 32. Raw is always better than cooked. Idea sounds clean and natural, but it's way more nuanced than that, and for a lot of foods it's actually backwards. Yeah, some fruits and vegetables are great raw. You keep certain vitamins intact and get that crunch. But cooking isn't some evil process that destroys everything good. In many cases, it actually improves the nutritional value. Cooking can break down tough plant cell walls, which makes it easier for your body to absorb nutrients. Things like tomatoes, carrots, spinach, all have compounds that become more bioavailable after cooking. So you're not losing out, you're often getting more out of them. And then there's the fact that a lot of foods straight up need to be cooked to be safe or even digestible. Beans, grains, potatoes, meat. These aren't just less optimal raw. They can be harmful or basically useless nutritionally if you don't cook them properly. Your body just isn't equipped to handle everything in its raw form efficiently. What people are really picking up on is that overly processed or overcooked foods can lose quality. But that doesn't mean raw is automatically superior. It's just another case of taking a small truth and stretching it into a blanket rule. In reality, a mix of raw and cooked foods is what actually makes sense, not treating cooking like it's ruining your food. Story 33. Don't let someone with a concussion fall asleep thing is one of those myths that just refuses to die. Probably because it sounds like you're being cautious, but it's not actually how concussions are managed. People act like sleep is dangerous, when in reality it's usually one of the best things for recovery. The confusion comes from older advice where you'd keep someone awake to monitor for signs of a more serious brain injury like worsening symptoms or loss of consciousness. But that doesn't mean sleep itself is harmful. It just means you want to make sure the person is stable first. Once that's established, letting them rest is actually beneficial. Sleep helps the brain recover, and with a concussion, avoiding stimulation is a big part of feeling better. Bright lights, screens, noise, all of that can make symptoms worse, so sleep is kind of the opposite of that. It gives the brain a break. The important part is making sure there aren't red flags beforehand, like severe confusion, repeated vomiting, or worsening symptoms. But once those are ruled out, there's no reason to keep someone awake just for the sake of it. It's another case where a precaution got turned into a hard rule, and now people think rest is dangerous when it's actually one of the most helpful things you can do. Story 34. Fluoride is toxic and slowly killing you thing gets pushed so hard online, and it ends up scaring people away from something that's actually one of the simplest and most effective ways to protect your teeth. Fluoride isn't some random chemical they threw into toothpaste for fun. It's there because it helps strengthen enamel and makes your teeth more resistant to decay. What people miss is that dosage matters, like with basically anything. Yeah, fluoride can be harmful in extreme amounts, but the levels used in toothpaste and water are carefully controlled and well within safe limits. You're not getting poison from brushing your teeth twice a day. You're doing basic maintenance, and the effects aren't immediate, which is why people underestimate it. You don't stop using fluoride and suddenly feel your teeth getting weaker. It's gradual. Over time though, without that extra protection, enamel is more vulnerable and cavities become way more likely. That's why dentists are so consistent about it. Not because of some conspiracy, but because it's one of the easiest preventative tools we have. It's cheap, accessible, and it works quietly in the background. It's frustrating because people avoid it thinking they're being healthier or more natural, when in reality they're just removing a layer of protection for no real benefit. It's one of those situations where fear of a chemical ends up causing a very real, very preventable problem later on. Story 35. The idea that doctors and the pharmaceutical industry are all working together to keep people sick sounds dramatic. But it falls apart pretty quickly when you actually think through how medicine works in practice. Doctors don't benefit from you being chronically ill in the way people imagine. Their entire training is focused on diagnosing, treating, and preventing disease, not maintaining it. A lot of the confusion comes from mixing up a few real issues, like high drug prices, aggressive marketing by some companies, or flaws in healthcare systems, and then jumping to a full-blown conspiracy. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry is a business, and there are valid criticisms there. But that doesn't mean every treatment or doctor is part of some coordinated effort to keep people unwell. If anything, modern medicine has consistently moved toward prevention and better long-term outcomes, vaccines, early screenings, improved treatments, all of which reduce illness, not prolong it. It wouldn't make sense to spend decades developing cures and better therapies if the goal was to keep people sick. What people often see is ongoing treatment for chronic conditions and assume that means nothing is being fixed. But a lot of those conditions just don't have simple cures. Managing them is still a huge improvement over what used to be possible. It's one of those beliefs that grows out of distrust, but it ends up ignoring how much progress has actually been made in keeping people healthier and living longer. Story 36. It's full of chemicals argument is one of those things that sounds meaningful, but actually says nothing at all once you think about it for more than 2 seconds. Everything is chemical. Water is a chemical. Oxygen is a chemical. The food you eat, the air you breathe, your own body, all chemicals. Saying something has chemicals in it is like saying it exists. What people usually mean is, it has synthetic or unfamiliar ingredients. But instead of saying that, they default to chemicals because it sounds scary. The problem is that natural versus synthetic doesn't automatically tell you anything about safety. Plenty of natural substances are toxic, and plenty of lab-made ones are perfectly safe. The origin isn't what matters, it's the actual properties and dosage. And that's the key thing people skip over. Dosage. Literally anything can be harmful in the wrong amount, even water. At the same time, something that sounds complicated or chemically can be completely harmless in the amounts used. The name doesn't determine the risk. It's just a shortcut people use instead of understanding what's actually in something, because chemical has become a buzzword for bad, even though it's scientifically meaningless in that context. You're not avoiding chemicals, you can't. You are chemicals. The only real question is which ones and how much. Story 37. Only drink water when you're thirsty. Thing sounds logical on the surface, but taken as a strict rule, it's kind of misleading. Thirst is a signal, yeah, but it's not always perfectly timed or reliable, especially depending on the situation. By the time you feel thirsty, your body is already a bit behind on fluids. And for most people, that's not a big deal day to day. But it shows that thirst isn't some flawless early warning system. And there are plenty of cases where it's even less reliable, like during intense exercise, hot weather, illness, or in older adults where the thirst response can be weaker. If you only ever drink when you feel thirsty and ignore everything else, it's easy to end up underhydrated without really noticing, especially if you're busy or not paying attention. On the flip side, you don't need to obsessively chug water either. It's not about forcing it constantly. It's more about being a bit proactive, drinking regularly throughout the day, adjusting based on your activity and environment instead of treating hydration like a reaction-only system. Like a lot of these myths, it takes something true. Thirst matters and turns it into a rigid rule that doesn't hold up in real life. Story 38. Cleanses are one of those things that sound productive, like you're hitting a reset button on your body, but in reality they're mostly just marketing wrapped around something your body already does constantly. You don't need a special juice, tea, or multi-day plan to clean yourself out, because your liver, kidneys, and digestive system are already handling that 24/7 without any help. The idea that you're full of vague toxins that need to be flushed out is super unclear on purpose, because if your body actually couldn't remove waste properly, you wouldn't fix that with a cleanse. You'd need medical treatment. These products just take normal processes like going to the bathroom more often, or sweating and rebrand them as a proof that something special is happening. A lot of the time, people feel better during a cleanse because they're temporarily eating less, drinking more water, or cutting out junk food. not because anything is being detoxed. It's the lifestyle change doing the work, not the cleanse itself. It's kind of ironic when you think about it. People are paying money for something their body is already doing for free and doing more effectively. In reality, the best cleanse is just basic habits. Stay hydrated, eat reasonably well, and let your organs do the job they've been doing your entire life. Story 39. Putting butter on a burn is one of those old school remedies that somehow stuck around, even though it actually makes things worse instead of better. It feels soothing for a second, so people assume it's helping, but what it really does is trap heat in the skin. And with a burn, the goal is the exact opposite. You want to cool it down and stop the damage from continuing. Butter, or any grease, oil, etc., basically creates a barrier that keeps the heat from escaping, which can make the burn go deeper. On top of that, it's not sterile, so you're also increasing the risk of infection by putting something like that on already damaged skin. What you actually want to do is run the burn under cool, not ice cold water for several minutes, let the heat dissipate, and then keep it clean and protected. That does way more for healing than any kitchen remedy. It's just one of those myths that probably came from people trying to soothe the skin without understanding what a burn actually needs. It might feel helpful in the moment, but it's doing the opposite of what you want long term. Story 40. The idea that pouring hydrogen peroxide on a wound is good for it is one of those habits a lot of people grew up with, but it's actually not something you want to keep doing. Yeah, it bubbles and looks like it's cleaning everything out so it feels effective, but that bubbling is basically damaging tissue, not just killing germs. Peroxide doesn't really discriminate. It can kill bacteria, but it can also harm the healthy cells your body needs to repair the wound. So instead of helping healing, it can actually slow it down, especially if you keep using it repeatedly. That's why the recommendation now is way simpler. Just rinse the wound with clean water and mild soap around it. Keep it clean and protect it. Your body does the rest. You don't need to nuke the area with something harsh every time. It's one of those things that stuck around because it looks like it's doing a lot. Bubbles means action, but in reality, gentler care is what actually leads to better healing.